Okay, so here we have a video all about the ancient city of Baghdad. We've been building up towards this for a little while by learning about the Silk Road, leaving off where on our previous topic with the Vikings and where they used to sell a lot of their goods was at one end of the Silk Road, and they would be transported all across the ancient world. And then we have then looked forward onto this area, which is Baghdad, and this is one of the more famous stopping points on the Silk Road and one of those cities that really flourished from the trade that was developing more and more along these lines. Now, here is a map of a large part of the earth, and here we can see that there are countries such as India, and then we have China over here, the continent of Africa. And as we know that much of the Silk Road moved along this route through Afghanistan, modern day Pakistan, Persia, and then out through here up towards Istanbul, where my pencil just was. And up in the corner here we'll be able to see we've got England. So we can see the Vikings may have been raiding England, and then through Europe or around they would have brought their trade to this area here, and then that would have embarked upon the Silk Road. And you can see pretty much in the middle of all these points we have the city of Baghdad, highlighted by that red star. And just a little bit more of a drawing there. So there we have that middle city of Baghdad in that important area that we now know as the Middle East today. So, zooming in a bit more, we have, as we mentioned, Baghdad, but as you can see, it is between two really large rivers. Now, the rivers are really significant, as in the ancient world, fresh water was incredibly important, so important to the sustaining ancient civilization. So the Roman Empire would build aqueducts, and they would build lots of ingenious methods to transport fresh water from one location to another. The ancient Greeks had many of their cities built around freshwater supplies because their land was quite barren in comparison to many other parts of Europe, so it was hard for them to get fresh water. And the ancient civilization of Egypt, which is just down here, built their entire civilization around the River Nile. Now, these rivers were so important because each year they would flood, and the rivers would burst their banks and flood everywhere. Now, nowadays, flooding tends to be considered as quite a bad thing, but in ancient times, it was considered a blessing because the flood would bring enriched soil that's full of nutrients. So the plants would really need all of the different nutrients that came from the flooding. So many of the soils would come out of the mountains and hilly areas. They'd be carried by those flood waters, and then when you got down to the flatter areas around here, the rivers would flood, and then they would leave all that nutrient-rich soil for plants to grow, so farmers could then grow their crops from it, and that would mean there was a constant supply of food, which obviously these larger cities needed because you had such a concentration of people in those locations. And it was exactly the same as you had in the ancient Egyptian civilization, where the flooded water would travel from quite far away in Africa and then travel down the River Nile and then flood this area of the River Nile, and the people there really relied on that each year. So Baghdad, you can see, is quite strategically placed in between these areas, so would benefit from that natural occurrence. So I managed to get together some artists' impressions of ancient Baghdad. Now, these are just people's impressions, modern day impressions of what the city used to look like during ancient times. They've based those on lots of different historical sources rather than idle speculation. And what I want you to do is, when you look at those, I want you to look at them really carefully and think about what questions you would like to ask about those particular cities, and you might be able to work out some of the answers when we go through. So let's have a look at the first one. So here we have one artist impression of the ancient city of Baghdad. And the first thing I want you to think about are those questions. What is straight away in your mind? I know what's in mine. First thing I would be thinking about is, why is it circular? That's so unusual. Okay. The next thing I might be thinking about is what's so special about in the middle part here. Then I might be thinking, why is it split into sections? Does each section represent something different? And those are the first questions that popped into my head. You may have different ones, but that's certainly, looking at this artist's impression, what I thought straight away. Let's have a look at the next one. Okay, so looking at this one, I can see there's lots of similarities, lots of things that I notice are the same. So I can see it's circular still, and I'm still wondering why circular. I can see that there are still sections, although perhaps not as clearly defined as the other picture showed. I can still see that there is a gardened area here, and I can still see that there are two central buildings, and I wonder what makes those so important. Maybe it's a palace, or maybe it's something different. So here we have a picture. Now this is not a picture from the time, but this is a reconstruction much later. And what you're seeing here is an example of some of the most important buildings, or one of the most important buildings in ancient Baghdad. And this is the House of Wisdom. Now the House of Wisdom was a place where scholars, academics met. There were lots and lots of books that had been discovered throughout the ages and collected there. Some of them the only copies of those books that existed. And these books have been created in Greece, Rome, all over the world. And the scholars at Baghdad wanted to keep them all in one place and use them for learning to benefit everybody around them. Now here we have a bit of a close-up view of an artist's impression of that House of Wisdom, and you can see scholars are in the background discussing things, but you can also see the different way in which books are being read. We have a tendency to sit at a table, very much like the guys in the background, and read there, whereas you can see that there is a different way of holding the book open, and here you're sat down and you are reading it in a completely different fashion than perhaps we are used to when you're reading something of academic purposes. So it's quite interesting and a different approach. Here we have slightly different artist's impression again. This one at a table, the books are in the background, and here you can see something is being written, but again a different seating position than perhaps we're used to, but some of the same themes about having the huge wealth of knowledge kept in one place is still the same. Now this particular drawing is much older. This one I believe comes from about the 13th century. Now this is a lot after the time we're talking about, but this was a drawing created of a typical ancient Islamic scene. So we can see here that we've got people moving cattle in the background across a bridge. We've got people sitting around the waters. Some are playing instruments, others are sharing gifts. There are people talking. So you have an impression that this was a place where you could have conversations about scholarly facts. You could talk about inventions, theories, scientific ideas, whilst at the same time normal life was carrying on around you. So very much like what we have today. You'll still have the traffic outside, you'll still have the cars whiz around, people doing their jobs, but at the same time there'll still be those discussions, those thoughts, those meetings taking place that might be shaping the world around us. Here we have another view. Now this one came also from, I believe, the 13th century, and this one was meant to show the set out of a village. Now what you may notice as you look through this is that village life is continuing as normal. So you can see people are moving around via camel, but you can also see there's a river running through, so that idea of water is important. You've got important things to the village. So you've got fruits that feed the village are there, but you've also got the mosque as an important religious structure. But then you can see that the houses are very, very close together. So not quite like houses as we have them today, where you have an upstairs, a downstairs, maybe a gap in between. This is very, very, very compact housing. So thin walls, people living next door to each other. So you've got one person living there. You've got animals very next door. A whole family here. Looks like a lady and a gentleman having an argument there. As the houses are so close together, cockerels on top, and then other members of society all around with normal everyday life going past. And I think if you think back to the video I made about Sinbad the Sailor using Marcia Williams' comic book, she had lots and lots of things going on in the background. Everything was really busy. There was something going on. So there were people looking out the windows to see what was happening. There were things happening on the roofs. There were animals kept up there. There were animals in the streets. And that gave away to loads and loads of little subplots that were going on. And this is what you're seeing from pictures from the 13th century as well. So she was really portraying that theme of a close community, close in proximity to one another. They were close physically to one another, as well as through their learning and what they were doing as a community. So there's a much better close-up view. So if you want to have a pause and have a look, you can see some of the things that I've talked about, including what looks like an argument in the middle. Now here we have an example of an early school, and in Baghdad it was thought really important that different sections of the city were dedicated to things like markets and schools, so people could learn, further themselves, improve themselves, and then further and improve the community. And here you can see the school teacher, and they are teaching, and you can see the pupils sat down on the floor, very much like we would do for collective worship in the hall, and those ideas, concepts are busy being shared there. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to take a few notes. I've also put in a link for an excellent video the BBC have done, and they really elaborate a lot more on Baghdad. They explain about the buildings in the middle. They explain about the different sections of the city, and they tell it from the point of view of a child at the time. So they're well worth having a look to get extra information on. They will explain a lot more about the layout of the city, and really help you with those research facts to collect for your book. Right, thank you very much.